Yeah, so we are live now. Uh, Hello, very good evening, everyone. We'll get started in few seconds. Okay, so yeah, let's get started. Very warm welcome to everyone. This is Shiv speaking on OT Security Huddle episode 9. And like all exciting episode today, we have a very focused discussion on building defensible architecture. And this topic is outcome of the discussion which I had with Daniel, which is new to the platform and also very enthusiastic and knowledgeable person on OT security. I'm really impressed by the knowledge that he's possessing on OT security, to be very honest. So welcome, Daniel, on the platform. Thanks for taking time to put up this content. And this is a topic which is also very interesting for me as well, because I come from a background on critical infrastructure protection, so always very close to me. So without further ado, let's get started because we have a very tight schedule for the day. Let me quickly throw the slides up. Hope my screen is visible. Okay, so before we begin, it's a quick disclaimer that whatever opinion and the viewpoints that we are discussing is the outcome of our personal experience and opinion and nothing to do with the organizations that we are associated with. Today, the speaker for the session joining me is Daniel. Daniel is coming from Australia and it's quite late there. Still, he was so excited to do this session. We have been discussing it for quite a few weeks. And I'm really happy, Daniel, for you to putting the effort. The content is really interesting for me as well. I really look forward to some positive discussions over here. So again, very warm welcome, and I would like you to maybe take a quick moment on your association, and we have also put up a special logo this time, Skadi Solutions. So maybe you take a quick moment to introduce what is that and what are your work area that you're currently working.
Thank you, Shiv. Thanks for having me on OT Security Huddle. Very excited. Really love your courses, your content, and yeah, it's really good to be part of the community. So my name is Daniel Castillo. I'm the CEO and founder of Skadi Solutions. We are an Australian-based cybersecurity company that primarily operates in the critical infrastructure and building technology space. We really looked at the market and observed that a lot of organizations were really struggling to combat the challenge of cyber uplift, particularly with the IT and OT environments. And what we wanted to do really was take a different approach to the market. And that really is one that looks at holistic uplift of both the IT and the OT segments across enterprise, as opposed to looking at one or the other. And what we really think that lets us do is break down some of the barriers that we all know about between the engineering workforce and the cyber counterparts, getting them talking, getting them communicating more. And by taking this kind of unified approach, I really endeavor that we're going to push the needle on the OT resilience piece that we're going to talk a little bit about when we get into the content, and get some ongoing improvement happening in these organizations. Very, very quickly on just me personally. So I'm a mechatronics engineer by trade. I used to do robotics and all types of automation. Like Shiv, I also worked in the control systems integration space for several years. I spent some time at Australian Signals Directorate as well, working on critical infrastructure. And now I'm looking at this Skadi Solutions as the new journey for me.
Again, yeah, thanks for that quite wonderful introduction, and it shows your expertise on the subject, Daniel. I'm equally excited to have this discussion. So let's quickly move forward. So what we are going to discuss is a brief overview of resiliency in critical infrastructure. We actually planning to build it as a series, at least 3 episodes, and the first one would be on defensible architecture. Then we'll quickly see the 5 principles which are very important for defensibility of critical infrastructures. We'll quickly look into the common mistakes or the pitfalls which might compromise defensibility of these critical infrastructures. And finally, what does this all translate into? A quick example, how we can actually use this knowledge to build a defensible architecture. So with that, over to you, Daniel. Maybe what do you mean by resilience in critical infrastructure?
Yeah. Thank you. So, look, for me, first of all, on the series, and we're not sure how many parts, and but yet we'll figure that out. But for me, defensible architecture really is a core element of this concept of resiliency. Um, I always kind of hear this argument between cybersecurity maturity versus critical infrastructure resilience. Uh, they are very similar and often mistaken, but they mean very different things. When I look at cyber resilience and cyber uplift, generally we're talking about things about the compliance against a framework. So it's always about, well, how do I get to Essential 8 level 1, or it's about how do I do AES CSF SP2 or something like this. And for me, it's an approach that, while it helps us have that conversation around where do we start, what do we do to do cybersecurity maturity uplift, for me, it's not the engineering approach, and it doesn't translate always to incremental improvement, which is what we really want to look at. And when we talk about, we're going to talk about SRP and the sort of primary goals in critical infrastructure. But for me, the whole reason behind doing cybersecurity is around securing operational performance, reliability, and that sort of very different, more engineering focused approach as opposed to cyber for cyber's sake is what resiliency is all about. And you can see on the right, like I love Ralph Langer. He always has great little quotes and things like that he puts on LinkedIn. But it's really about building a performance-based security program that's about incremental uplift as opposed to trying to play whack-a-mole with threats and nation-state actors and all of this.
Yeah, so to differentiate this with the risk base, which is generally the talk of the town in any of this cybersecurity standard for OT, we generally talk of risk first, and this is a new pointer that you are actually introducing, performance. So would you see this as risk being the inherent part of performance, or these two are the different concepts altogether?
Yeah. So the one problem I have with that picture is that risk-based security is still the core of OT security. It's about what are the pragmatic controls to bring risk within a tolerance level. So 100%, we still need to do our risk assessment. We still need to do our vulnerability assessment. We still need to lead with risk, but we need to make sure that we're not getting scared of the various nation state actors and all the media coming out around, OT security is, the big new scary thing. It is something that is achievable, and it's something that you need to look at more pragmatically through incremental improvement, as opposed to just saying there's a massive risk and we just need to do something. Let's start very programmatically. What do we do about cybersecurity?
Yeah. So yeah, the next step I see in the slide that you have very well defined what is OT and the critical infrastructure, and this is specifically of interest to me that I recently come across with one of the professional in OT world, and then the understanding is quite vague in terms of what is OT and what is not OT. So would you like to take a moment to maybe clarify that what exactly is OT and what
Yeah.
is IT at high level?
Yeah. So at the high level, when we're talking about IT, we're talking about systems that support data, data storage, data transition, data manipulation. And then when we're talking about OT, it's about physical process control, control systems, manipulation of physical assets. Um, what's really interesting is, and I sort of talked a little bit about Skadi Solutions before. Critical infrastructure is a big part of our business, but it's not the only business. I actually used to work for a long time in building automation, which is very often I hear people say that's not OT, that's IoT, or that is something else, and it's true. Um, Building automation versus the critical infrastructure, very, very different architecture, different needs, different budgets. Everything is different, but OT is the term that binds all of that together. So building technology, critical infrastructure, different. OT is the catch-all that covers DCS, SCADA, all of the different physical applications and processes.
I'm still interested to get a clear answer. So let me rephrase that uh, we control physical processes and we control the data. In both of them, there is a good amount of technology that is common, like the Windows operating system. So would you call a Windows operating system an IT system or an OT system?
Well, that's a tricky one. um, I think for me, it comes down to the function. It's what is the function that asset supports. So
Yeah,
typically, when I talk to customers and I talk to people, I talk about workstations and servers and apps. This is what I call traditional ICT or traditional IT assets. That's something that people feel a little bit more familiar with because at the end of the day,
yeah.
it's Windows, it's Linux, it's switches, it's firewall, it's all the same stuff as IT. The thing that for me makes it OT is when it's the underlying function of what does that do, what does that
Yeah.
support.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, this is what I wanted to hear from you as well, so that we discuss this and then this settles the confusion. So anything which is a server or a operating system, irrespective of the flavor, used for controlling a physical process is basically an OT. Whereas you can call the controllers and the IDs or SCADA as ICS, but actually overall it makes an operational technology system. Uh, let's move forward. Yeah. So quick introduction about the series. What are you having in offering in the further episodes of this resilience series?
Yeah. So we need to discuss, but for me, defensible architecture is the bedrock of it. Um, there is a big part around asset management, asset inventorization, and criticality. I think some of that is partially covered in this topic, so maybe we don't have to look at that again, but we'll see. The other bit that I really think needs to be discussed is the incident response specific to the OT. Um, it's very much part cyber incident response and very much part business continuity, and there's a lot of nuance to that discussion that I think we should have. And then the final part potentially might be around even some more of the government's elements around, how do you bring up these conversations and do continuous process development with your executive stakeholders. Vulnerability management's another really interesting one. There's a lot of topics. You'll see on the right, we actually put up a really, really great white paper that comes from the NCSC out of the UK. Some of this stuff is, from my brain. A lot of it is from industry, and it's the stuff that's been, the industry has been telling us very clearly this is what we need to focus on. And the NCSC's guide on securing operational technology gives a really good guide on this, and it includes things like defensible architecture and OT incident response, all this type of stuff.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. So yeah, let's start with the defensible architecture. What are the common guidance available for building an defensible architecture?
Yeah. So Sorry. So I think it's good to start with the guidance. So the really, really big guidance, first of all, is from the big organizations like CISA. So 7 steps to effectively defend. ICS is a really good one. That's what's on the right hand side over there. So this really talks about 7 strategies or sectors. They actually do something else very interesting. They put percentage in terms of how effective is each strategy or control to actually delivering uplift. I don't know if I necessarily agree with those percentages. This is an old document, I think, from 2015. So for me,
Mhm.
defensible architecture is very, very important. I definitely put it above 9%. But these are the kind of bits that add up into there. The Department of Energy also gives a guidance on 21 steps to the cybersecurity of SCADA networks. Again, defensible architecture is mentioned as a concept. The other one is the NIST 800 82R3. Now, they don't talk about defensible architecture, but a lot of the same principles are discussed there. And what they call it is defense in depth architecture. They don't call it defensible architecture. So that's a whole sort of I don't know about misunderstanding, but the wording changes, but the core principle about defensible architecture is very clear in all of this material.
All right. Yeah, so this is what you are talking about, the defense in depth versus defensible architecture. But if we have to explain it, what would be the right way to differentiate defense in depth versus defensible architecture?
Yeah. So for me, when I think about defense in depth, I take the more traditional IT meaning of the word, which is effectively taking several different controls and layering them. So then one control fails, you have another control. That control fails, you have another control. It's about not just, putting up a strong firewall for perimeter and then you don't do anything else. No, we do a layered approach that factors in multiple avenues of threats. So for me, that is defense in depth. Defensible architecture is different, and the best way that I like to describe it is like World War One trench warfare. It's this idea of effectively having very clearly defined footholds, and that effectively gives you the ability and capability to retreat as the threat encroaches on your space. So if a threat compromises one component of the environment and you effectively lose control or of integrity of that sector, you have the capability to island or enter a shields up state where you can cut that off from your overall architecture, and then you can continue to operate as you eradicate, remediate, rebuild, and you can do this multiple times. So when you get hacked, you're not losing your entire environment, you're only losing a subset, and you have the ability to retreat and advance and as you eradicate and deal with the threat.
Yeah, this is a very, very beautiful analogy to describe it, like the island mode. And I think uh, I'm seeing that in the following slides, we will eventually build upon that, how to actually create a architecture which can be separated when the incident arrives, and how best we can use these technologies. Okay, so what are the key principles that we can use as a thumb rule for this defensible architecture?
Yeah. So we're going to go one by one through these, but high level, when I was thinking, what do you need to do to implement defensible architecture? Number one for me, it's this concept of OT sovereignty. I really want to coin this word and use this word, and I want it to catch on. It's this idea of effectively understanding what are the assets that are critical to the process, and those assets and information should be kept separate from your corporate and your IT, and they should be protected in the same way as the control system. So in that way, you maintain the sovereignty with all my OT stuff is separate and protected. The second one is about the sort of boundary controls. So the 62443 boundary controls and zoning. It's about understanding, well, where are my ins and outs? How do I monitor those? And how do I restrict the data flow to the minimum required privilege? The third bit is really about the incident response component. It's about what does it look like for me if I'm undergoing a threat for me to enter an elevated state of monitoring or to segment certain elements of or sectors of my environment. So if someone gives me a call like the NSA or ASD or whoever it may be and says sector A is under threat, or you have threat intel that tells you that you're going to get hacked, you can enter proactively this shields up state, and you know exactly what's going to fail, what's going to continue to operate, and you know how long you can stay in that state. The fourth one is about safety and process functionality, and it's not really a technical guidance. It's more just the sort of idea of when we do defensible architecture, we need to be considering safety and process functionality as the core element of that. And then the final thing is just around doing this stuff proactively, because it's very hard to implement defensible architecture once you've been hacked. You need to do it progressively and incrementally ahead of time.
Yeah, that looks very, very clear to me that I need to first start with segregating my infrastructure and then having a clear responsibility to monitor, finally building up specific islands, and then eventually getting towards the aspects of safety and the ability to respond when an incident arrives. So let's dig a bit deeper into each of these concepts. First one is your favorite, maintaining the OT sovereignty. So, what are the key things that you will be using to define the sovereignty?
Yeah. So for me, the sovereignty really is a critical infrastructure specific term. And it's this idea of trying to separate OT stuff from your IT stuff and from your internet. Um, there's a lot of debate about, this is OT attack, this is IT attack, they are not the same, and et cetera, et cetera. The thing that we can all agree on, I think, is that most attacks are targeted at the IT environment, and the IT environment ultimately has the largest attack surface because it has internet connected things, it has people browsing documents, browsing the web. Lots and lots of bad stuff happens in the IT environment, and at the end of the day, the first part of doing OT sovereignty, the reason to do OT sovereignty is ultimately we can't trust that our IT environment is not compromised. And we can see that with a lot of the material coming out around the PRC and about the GRU and a lot of this concept of living off the land. We need to start thinking about, well, what if the adversary is already inside of our IT environment? We can't assume that our IT environment is safe, and we need to operate in a way that the OT environment is very much protected and separate because we're assuming that the IT environment is already compromised.
Yeah.
So the second bit really is about it's kind of this crown jewels assessment, asset inventorization. For me, I just made a list here of, well, what are the bits that I would consider OT? What needs to be kept totally separate? And you can see there things like management services, so hypervisor, backups, domain controllers, jump boxes, firewalls, all these types of things are things that are effectively very critical to the process. And if you lose your AD on your IT side, you've basically lost everything attached to it. So for that reason, we need to separate our ADs and we need to have dedicated instances of our core management services. And the MIS and the ERP potentially should be included inside of that. And there's a debate on, should it be in the IT, should it be in the OT? But that needs to be discussed by the organization. The other thing is the information assets. A lot of people forget about the config of the controllers, the ladder logic files, the SCADA graphics, all this information that is very explicitly for OT. Sometimes you see people, they store it in the G Suite or in the M365, and then they download it, then they transfer it to the OT, then they transfer it out, and it's we need to identify what's the OT specific information, and let's build a data store that's sovereign to the OT environment so we lose that risk of the file transfer.
Yeah,
And
I just wanted to add there a bit about the G Suite and M365 that you mentioned. That this understanding is uh, required very clearly that we should not put anything which is critical for our operation in operational technology over the cloud. This There is an incident that happened, and which we have also discussed on Huddle sessions last year, uh, about one of the pharma company. They got attacked with a ransomware, and then their backups were also in the cloud. So it actually delayed their mitigation mechanism. So we need to understand the risk of using these services. There, it is quite tempting to use them because they provide a good management efficiency. But on the other side, that is not our goal. Management is not our goal. Operation is our goal. So you want to have the capability to scramble your forces faster and then get it working as soon as possible. So yeah, for those critical systems, you need to have the backups in your control rather than leaving that to the attackers online.
Yeah, and I think there's a mention of SCADA in the cloud or OT in the cloud. I think late in one of the later slides, but that's an interesting conversation and very
Yeah,
topical.
yeah. Okay, so let's move forward to the next one, where we have discussed the sovereignty. But with the sovereignty, there is that challenge of management versus the operational convenience. And also, in the same organization, generally, the teams that look for security, they are generally common. So when you restrict the interfaces for IT and OT, the management becomes confusing. So how do you like to describe this restrictions between the boundaries of what should be the IT's role, what should be the OT's role? Should there be one unified cybersecurity team? Should there be two teams? How do you see this part of operations?
Yeah. So for me, first of all, I really need to stress just how important that data flow analysis or data flow restriction is. Um, we always talk about these OT environments are fairly static, and that, in an ideal world, if everything is inventorized and we can control all the workflows and data flows, then our risk immediately diminishes massively. Um, so when you have this data flow restriction, that is a principle of defensible architecture, because you are effectively limiting the blast radius of a potential attack. You're limiting it to a certain segment of the environment. Now, the business is always going to ask for integration. The administrators are always going to push for more access or more integration, some sort of reporting functionality, whatever it may be. But it's very important to uphold that data flow restriction. And in the case where you have some of these organizations that are not so heavily resourced, so regional councils and very small utilities, manufacturing plants, very, very small sites, they don't necessarily always have dedicated teams for each segment of the environment. So there's always going to be this need to support people moving all over through the environment. And that's where we need it's not to say that we need a dedicated team for IT and OT. What we need is logical controls to control those workflows. So separate credentials for if it's like one administrator that manages networks, they have separate credential for the IT, separate credential for the OT, separate domain admin for the IT, separate domain admin for the OT, no password replication. And then all of that is enforced, of course, by your boundary controls like your firewalls, your unidirectional gateways, any of this type of stuff. And in some cases, sometimes it's better to use a USB just to reduce the requirement for some of those over permissive data flows to be let through the boundary points.
Yeah, that's a very valid point. But having said that, you also mentioned about the domain controllers, and this gets me excited. There's general discussion whether you have a unified domain controller where people have this convenience of using the same credentials in both side for their business application versus their OT application. And on the other side, the security requirement and our experience says that we should have a completely separate domain controller and set of credentials for our OT side of the business. So I am a big preacher of the second option. You should not have the unification of the credential. If you see any of the big incident that happened, it always starts from the IT side of the world. And when the credentials get stolen, then it becomes little bit less effort for the attacker to get access to the OT device as well. What is your opinion? What would you choose? One unified credential set or two different set of credentials?
There's definitely no question about it. It's the second one. And it comes
Okay.
back to that whole piece around the OT sovereignty.
Mhm.
Not everyone's going to be able to afford separate AV, separate EDR, separate SIEM, separate everything. But the core management services must be separated. It's the bits around the Active Directory, the backup servers, Um, any of these very privileged services should be separated and dedicated, ideally on separate pieces of network infrastructure. And if you can't afford separate infrastructure, then you look at logical segmentation to break apart those networks. But in CI, in the type of risk and budgets that we're talking about, really should be maintaining this sovereignty between these core services.
Yeah. One more question about the same segregation and the segmentation. There are few systems which are quite confusing. Even in architecture, we have kept some deliberate blanks like enterprise and remote systems with no names. What would be the ideal position for the systems like MIS or ERPs? You would put it into the OT side or you would put into the IT side?
I've been waiting for someone to give me the answers to that for many years. It's a very difficult thing. For me, and it's a cop out answer, but it always comes back to risk assessment. You need to understand what the dependencies are. Um, Classic case Colonial Pipeline, when we look at that, um, we saw that that was an IT focused incident, but the end result was that the process stopped because shipping and logistics components in the IT environment were compromised. So it really comes down to the business to analyze the different applications, their purpose, and their criticality to the process. If an element of ERP or MIS is critical to the process, then I would argue that there is a justification to segregate that to the OT environment, or at least segregate that from the other business apps in the IT environment.
All right, makes sense. Okay, so I've also put up some pointers like joining and conduits, and this is definitely the 62443 language. One key misunderstanding about this Purdue model that we generally see is whether it's a security model or it's a network model, what kind of model it is. So, would you like to clarify that? What is the essence of a Purdue model? Why it is
Yeah.
being made?
Yeah. So I had Purdue model on the last slide, and I think Purdue model is important. It has a purpose and has a function. For
Mhm.
me, it really comes back to giving us a framework to classify asset functionality. So we can take different components like the management components versus the controllers versus the EWS versus the HMI. We can classify these in Purdue model and very easily understand that this is the associated function. And that helps guide our segmentation strategy. Now, you'll see in the example that it's not that simple in terms of just saying, okay, I'm going to make a zone. I'm going to make one zone for my layer 3. I'm going to make one zone for my layer 2. I'm going to make one zone for my layer 4. It's not that simple. The segmentation needs to be done in a risk assessed manner in alignment with 62443. But
Yeah,
when we look at that process and we're trying to do our asset classification, Purdue is a very helpful reference model for that.
absolutely. Yeah. So basically, it's a functional model. It's not a security model. It's not a network model, and we need to treat it that way.
Yeah.
Okay. So now talking about the shield up, which I would like to call it as a making the islands. How do you define the shields, and what are the best way to putting up these shields in the environment?
Yeah. So I like the term island mode. Island mode is used in 62443 and several of the other
Mhm.
standards to sort of guide, I guess, the required functionality in a OT or critical infrastructure deployment. The reason I use Shields Up and the discussion for this session really is focused around the architecture piece, but Shields Up goes beyond that. Shields Up includes things like if I'm in an elevated state of threat, what is the elevated response in terms of my threat monitoring and detection? So Shields Up effectively means I am ready for war. I'm ready to be attacked and I am changing my mode of operation. Potentially, I'm even operating in a degraded state to allow me to become more defensible and limit my attack surface until I'm in a place where I feel like the risk has diminished to a level that I'm okay with.
Yeah. So basically, everything boils down to the risk and then managing the risk in an effective way, which is agreeable to all the stakeholder.
Yep.
Okay. So, what are the key components that would support the island mod?
Yeah. So you talked before about, what supports it, what does defensible architecture have to do with shields up, and really it comes down to you can't really do shields up and you can't do island mode unless you have the capability to do so. If you have two Active Directories and they are totally converged and you've got shared credentials, shared jump box, shared everything, you can't just go and re-IP the entire environment and break them apart. It is, you can pull out a cable, but then if you haven't architected it in a sovereign way, pulling out a cable is not going to remove all of the data flows because you haven't limited it to a set of conduits. So you can say, yes, this one cable is my one connection from my IT to my OT. So
Hmm.
defensible architecture really is the capability to perform islanding, segmentation, and elevated monitoring at the main conduits that bridge those different trenches together. So one part of that is not just doing one mode of shields up, but having a tiered approach. So being able to, for example, I'm going to separate my IT from the internet. Next, I'm going to separate my IT from my OT. Next, I'm going to separate my supervisory components from the DCS or the field engineering. So every time you cut something off, you lose a little bit of functionality and a little bit of visibility, but the process becomes more and more sort of disconnected. And ideally, you can contain all the way to the point that you can um, safely say that, yes, we've contained the threat and we're going to eradicate it and rebuild and reconnect everything together. And the other part really is around the flexibility. So, how long can I actually remain islanded? If you haven't done the pre work to actually understand, well, if I unplug that cable, what services fail, what dependencies are affected, it's very difficult for you to actually go and pull that cable or change that firewall rule. So defensible architecture really is about giving yourself the flexibility to make conscious decisions about segmentation and segregation in response to a threat.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So moving forward, the priorities, which are very straight, we always want to put safety first, and then of course the functionality should be intact with the integrity and reliability. What is the message that you would like to convey here for prioritizing these concepts for resiliency?
Yeah, this is a bit of a message more to the cyber folks and the IT folks than the OT ones, and it comes back to a bit of like an anecdote that I have from a customer that I worked with once upon a time, and we talked about the capability of performing segmentation or segregation between the IT and the OT, and we talked about what containment looks like in the event that there was a compromise, and there was a discussion in where the IT team said, well, we're going to engage our DFIR, we're going to engage our retainer, and we're going to identify the root cause, eradicate the threat. And until that point, we're going to shut down the process. And that could take 2 to 3 weeks, could take a month. Ultimately, they said we don't know how long it will take, but we will not take any risks and we will cut off the environment connectivity until we're ready to say that the threat has been 100% eradicated. And it was very funny just watching the OT engineers have this moment where they're like, you guys don't understand what our priorities are, because ultimately the executives, the engineers are going to do whatever it is possible to get that environment back online. And if that includes connecting a dodgy router to get remote access to the OT environment so that they can continue to support and remotely work while the IT is down, then they'll do that. So we really need this sort of cross business alignment between IT and OT, understanding that the priorities are SRP, it's safety, and then it's performance, and then it's reliability. And ultimately, that comes above cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is the thing that enables this triad.
Yeah, very well said. So probably then the last principle out of these, the proactivity into the implementation. How do you like to convey this message of the ability to being agile and then scramble the teams to take proactive action when the incident are there?
Yeah. So for me, that the key outcome around the proactively is that idea that this is a capability that needs to be built. It needs to be tested. It needs to have procedures, and and a lot of the case, you need to buy things. You need to buy software. You need to buy hardware. Um, it's not just something that you can turn on. And ultimately, the payback of doing this investment is that the cost to respond and contain an incident will be massively reduced, and you will have much more assurance and resilience behind your process that it will actually be able to operate for an extended duration in the event that you need to segment these environments, or you need to or part of your environment is disrupted because of a threat.
Yeah. Okay, so you have wisely chosen Ralph's picture here, and which is a visionary, and his work on Stuxnet is quite evident. But what was the specific reason of choosing this Twitter post by Ralph? Would you like to give that explanation?
Yeah. So again, Ralph loves his hot takes, and pretty much most of the time, I think that they are pretty spot on, pretty correct.
Yeah,
And he's really talking here around. There's a lot of what he calls and what I like to refer to as fear, uncertainty, and doubt in the industry about the relevance and threat of cyber activity in the OT space, and um, regulation as well coming out to push the executives to do something about OT security. And it really does feel at times like we're just looking at a threat and then we're just playing whack-a-mole. We're like, oh, there's the threat. What do I need to do to mitigate that threat? What do I need to do to mitigate that threat? And it's very easy to take that very reactive approach, but it's much harder to sit down, build a program, and actually invest in capability uplift. And it doesn't have to be big capability uplift. It just has to be incremental, and it has to be driven by the principle of SRP. So that's really what this is all about, right? It's about investing in a roadmap to implement things like defensible architecture, embedding it into your procurement. So when you take on new builds and you do brownfield refresh, you working with your third-party system integrators, you can't just push that onto them. You have to take the responsibility, and you have to manage your enterprise architecture and have that program and investment in incremental uplift.
yeah, absolutely. This I like that you mentioned this. The one key thing that Ralph always advocates is FUDs, fear, uncertainty, and doubts. And it makes sense that we need not to poke down by the reports which are coming out. And when I attended this course, ICS 515, 2 years ago, one of the exercise was to identify whether the threat intelligence report is a real threat intelligence report or was it a campaign.
Mm.
So yeah, we need to understand that, and we should have that intelligence and the capability to treat the abundance of resources and these things in as a pinch of salt only. We
Yeah.
need not to take them as the absolute thing. We need to put the risk assessment working for us, and also see whether these are the genuine sources who are putting up these reports, or some motivated campaign that we are barging into.
Mm.
Yeah,
And threat intel is very important, but for me, it's for a more mature organization that has done the basic things. If
yeah,
you haven't done the basic stuff, you haven't set up your segmentation model, your defensible architecture strategy, or procedures for islanding and segmentation, then forget about trying to do specific detections for certain threat actors or anything like that. Just start with the basics.
yeah, makes sense. So, what are the common mistakes that you see we might get into when we are designing the defensible architecture?
Yeah. So it's a lot of the stuff that we talked about already, and it's I think it's catching on. I think people are. I've seen a lot of job specifications coming out recently, and they're like, "Oh, I need to bring someone on, a cybersecurity consultant, to help me with my segmenting or segregating my two ADs because they are together." Or I need help with doing a firewall, or I need help with doing asset inventorization. It's always the same type of stuff, and it comes back to these pitfalls. So very quickly, top to bottom, the first one is shared domain. If you have a shared domain, defensibility is immediately impacted. Same thing if it's a domain trust. Even if they're separate domains, if you have a trust, Microsoft very clearly says that is not a security boundary. So if you have a trust, you need to break your trust. The shared IT OT tooling is another one to a degree. I think it can be done.
Mhm.
Some people can't afford independent security tooling, but you need to be very well aware that in the event that some of that security tooling is compromised, that you can see things like what happened with CrowdStrike and some of these other incidents happen where something simple like an EDR or an app control application can actually be the thing that disrupts your process. So you need to really think about the risk behind those decisions. The other one is boundary firewall. So sometimes, in the best case, people put them back to back, and that's great. But then the same people are administering both firewalls and they're using the same credentials. So immediately you've lost any sort of capability that you've introduced by having those two firewalls back to back. The other one that I really, really think about is OT configuration management, about where and how you access your AWS machine and what is required to effectively update firmware, update logic code, this type of thing. I don't think we talk enough about these services being privileged services in terms of living off the land. Like, you can do a lot of damage through an EWS because generally they're
Yeah.
connected to everything. So if the EWS is connected to everything and it's very easy to get to them, that's probably going to compromise your defensibility. The I'm just going to quickly, so I'm going to talk about the two little diagrams on the side. So the first one is browse up administration. So this concept is basically you've got your, God mode admin, and he has access to sort of everything. Again, it's this idea of we need to segment the privileges. We need to implement things like phish-resistant MFA for access to the OT environment. We need to understand that even if it's one person, we need to tier that access. The other one is the management bypass, which is where you have a server that has access to everything. Very commonly, this is the SCADA server. I always see this. The SCADA server is used as a jump box to administer the AD. The SCADA server is used to perform logic changes. The SCADA server is just used for everything. And this is something that is a big issue. You need to introduce very clearly defined management zones and, avoid
Yeah.
doing
Yeah.
any sort of management bypass.
Yeah. I would also like to reiterate the last one, the storage of sensitive OT files on IT information repositories. So be very, very careful about those. Very often than not, our IT systems can be the part of any attack. And there might be a possibility that they are already under attack and we haven't able to detect them yet. Another important part is uh, the management systems which are being used by the IT teams for managing your segregated OT systems. So these systems, though they are very often connected for internet, they might have these malwares getting inside them, and when you connect it to your OT systems for management, then that could be the time when they actually get the infection. Laterally, the one example is the management laptops or engineering laptops being used, and these are the systems which are typically ignored, and most of the time you don't even have them in inventory, so that they could actually become one of the big pitfalls of having a secure architecture. Yeah, so I think we have kind of summarized this in a very nice manner, like starting with a sovereignty in the architecture, understanding what is there and how I would secure. I kind of like this term, like the governance that we see in our countries or the region. We can actually correlate with the same way that we have a government at the national level which will take care of the defense of international borders, and then you have local governments which will take care of the local borders. Finally, you have urban local bodies will take care of the local governance over there. So we are actually kind of enforcing the same way, that you have different segregation, different zones, and not only these zones are functional, but they will also have their own defense mechanism. So whenever there is a requirement, you invoke that defense mechanism, island them, segregate them, and then you are ensured that your minimum viable functionality is always up and your business is running as expected. Okay, so now we have one example, thanks to you, Daniel, that you put up. I would again like you to please give us this visual tour, how this defensible architecture looks like in action.
Yep. So this is something I put together in Visio. I just really wanted to, and I have to make sure that I give the disclaimer. Obviously, this is not a blueprint to go and do your network segmentation, but I think it demonstrates some of the principles in terms of how and where you might want to segment your environment, where you want to put controls in, and how you want to tier that sort of ability to do islanding and breakdown and do the segregation. In this example, you'll see, and if you move through the animation, you'll see that there are 3 trenches. So effectively, this supports the ability to island at 3 main zones. So the first zone is on the right. So if you hit the animation, one more. Yep. So trench 1. So this is like your IT environment. This is the first point of attack. The next trench will be the OT network. So everything inside of this sort of core supervisory zone. And then the third one will be the field, the remote site. And there is effectively can be trench 3, can be trench 4, 5, 6, however many DCS or isolated sites you have out in the field. So this segmentation model really looks at trying to build the capability to island and to segregate yourself at 3 primary trenches. You can go next. So with that in mind, we're going to go through 3 quick scenarios. So scenario number 1, internet-borne threat is targeting the IT. The first part is basically, well, I've detected a threat. It's very clearly hitting me. I'm getting all sorts of threat intel from the powers that be that we are under attack. So what can I do? I can defend my first trench, which is the trench between my IT and the internet. And because I have that firewall out at the DMZ, I have the capability to cut off connectivity very explicitly to something, for example, like remote services. So I can still maintain the capability because I'm an energy provider to maintain my IPsec connection to my retail. So my retail continues to operate, but I'm making a conscious decision to eliminate my remote services because of the threat that's currently hitting my environment. Now, this doesn't always work. Sometimes it's too late and they've already got a foothold. And in this case, now my IT environment is host. They've got my domain admin, and basically the whole environment is done. Now, when this happens, because again we have this trench-based defense, we island one more time. So we have the ability to segment again the boundary between the IT and the OT. The threat is contained and only really impacts the IT. So maybe some of your ERP might be affected, your productivity tools, but the core process is unaffected. Scenario number 2, sometimes threats directly impact the OT environment because it could be USB, could be a bad patch that was pushed down. Sometimes we have a random asset that's just connected to the internet. Can be many different things, but in the case that our core SCADA network is compromised, the same principles again apply. Now our trench 2 is impacted. So what do? We island again. So we can island at two main positions. So the first one would be between the IT and the OT environment again. The IT environment, while not as important as the SCADA, is still something that we want to separate because we don't want this become an organization-wide problem. And if you think about it, a lot of your security tooling actually often comes from the IT environment. So we want to make sure that we island them, and potentially we need to look at alternative methods to maintain our security capability. The second one would be islanding between the SCADA and the and the DCS. So we want to separate our remote sites that have the capability to operate independently from our core SCADA, because we now know that the SRP has been compromised on the core SCADA. So now our DCS can continue to work and our IT environment can continue to work. Now, the last scenario is that we have a DCS. So one of our remote sites is compromised. Again, same type of thing. Third-party vendor has caused this, or maybe one of our employees or our field technicians, who knows. Again, we have the capability to island. We island firstly between the DCS and the OT environment. Could you go next? Yep. So between the DCS and the OT environment, we are also technically islanding OT to OT as well. So we want to remove the possibility that one remote site could impact the other remote sites. So that's what we're doing when we island at this level. The second thing that we do is sometimes we have grid partners that actually connect into our environment. Very common, we see like OPC UA or something like this. We are pulling data. We want to obviously not risk our partners and our friends at AMO or our friends who are independent generators or whatever it may be. So we island from them as well, and we let them know what's happening. The last place that we actually island is, and this is the other bit of functionality where you've had a consideration for your protection equipment, your safety zone. So if you have any SIS, for example, if it's a gas or diesel generation related DCS site, then there will be safety concerns there. And we have the ability to island between our core DCS and our SIS. So the SIS can continue to protect the safety element.
Yeah, so this is a really, really good visual tool, which actually kind of visualizes the learnings that we had on the 5 different principles, and then implement them for working, and actually seeing what are the different areas that we might see the attack percolating, and then using the technology to segregate them. So we are very good in time. I knew that this is going to be a very elaborate and intriguing discussions, which actually glues on these different things, and still have left around 2 minutes to see if we have any questions. So while you were discussing, I was seeing some of the questions are already answered by some of our friends who are online. Let me quickly see if we can still take some. Okay. So one of the question is by Aditya. What is the biggest challenge you guys see in today's world of IoT, especially for connected vehicles? Yeah.
So this is so mining comes to mind immediately. So in the mining, we have this capability of autonomous and semi-autonomous vehicles in the supply chain. We also have the concept of autonomous vehicles for mining operations, and sometimes they're fully autonomous. Sometimes it's a person sitting at a console running Linux, and then that Linux is connected to the dozer in the field, and it's doing that. So the first part of the response, I think, with connected vehicles is that, do they have to be IoT? I would really question and challenge that. A lot of this stuff is designed to be resilient in the sense that it can operate on premise. And a lot of the time, the IoT functionality is not actually required when we talk about connected vehicles. Or if we're talking about connected vehicles, now we're talking about more of like less about the critical infrastructure. We're talking more about just, people's Teslas on the roads and things like that. That's a whole separate, I think, topic and discussion needs to be dealt with the product owner.
Yeah.
The only other thing I would say about IoT is obviously that's very, very relevant to building technologies. And for me, the biggest challenge really is just the push to innovate. Our asset owners are just being absolutely smashed by marketing and media, telling them that we need to do proactive maintenance, preventative maintenance. We need to use AI to ingest the data. We need to remain competitive. We need to hit our neighbors rating. There's all these initiatives that are pushing us to become internet connected. And I don't really think we have a choice, right? At the end of the day, we are there to enable the executives, and a lot of the executives want the benefit of connecting to the internet. So in that case, it really just comes down to, we just have to work on that incremental pragmatic approach to how do we securely facilitate that. But it's never going to go away. It's only going to continue. And that's the major challenge, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the specific context that he's asking about connected vehicles, we actually had to focus sessions on the same platform about vehicles. But IoT and industrial IoT have its own challenge. And few months ago, I think ISA has released a specific document for securing according to 62443 the industrial IoT devices. So that's one. And of course, the one big challenge is these systems are treated differently compared to your OT systems. They have limited compute power and they are remote. So lot of risk that can come in picture. There could be issues of physical security. There could be issues of device tampering itself. Then the issues of the broker getting compromised, and from the broker you push the patches, and then it could be you're actually seeing a different picture than what is actually happening in the field. So those kind of risk might be there with IoT and industrial IoT devices. Maybe we'll take one more questions, and I haven't scrolled at the bottom, but one which I see is what OT service and IoT systems would be advised to implement it with cloud systems. So
Well, I think I
this,
know Shiv's answer. Shiv's answer is none. Look, for me, it depends.
yeah,
Um, so there's something that came out. I think it came out from NCSC around operational securing operational or considerations for operational technology in the cloud. I would highly advise that you go online and look at that guidance from them. They don't explicitly say don't put stuff in the cloud. They just say think about it.
yeah,
From my perspective, ideally you should avoid it, but there are certain cases where it makes sense. And things come to mind like DERMS. So sometimes in energy, with again, it's like this whole IoT thing where you have to connect to many different assets or many different service, I guess, customers over a very disparate geographical region. Sometimes that's very hard to do when you are fully on-prem and when you don't have that cloud capability. And in that case, it might make more sense to have a cloud. My only advice would be maintaining the principle of defensible architecture. Don't chuck your OT cloud inside of your AWS that you use for your corporate. If you're going to do cloud, build a separate tenant, an entirely separate instance, and it should be segregated with the same types of zoning, and it should be effectively treated not as an extension of the on-prem, but as its own separate zone. And you do the same principles around privilege management and the like. But you just need to understand that when you go to cloud, there are many additional security concerns that you need to factor in there. But it does make sense for some functionality reasons.
yeah, absolutely correct. And I watch the same thinking. My answer is not binary, yes or no. I always advocate the risk-based system engineering. And for cloud systems, I think some of the solutions like managed services for even for security requirements, it makes much more sense to deploy them on cloud. For example, there could be a small industrial control system based organization, and they don't have the resources to manage their security. So they can actually outsource, and then the same can be in the cloud. They send the data, somebody process this and gives them the intel back about the information that they might be having. Similar case for other entities where they have geographically different location. They want to put something on the cloud and then visualize that at one place. So it's always depends on the risk and the business requirement for the organization. There cannot be one single answer. Technologies are designed to solve problems, not to create more. So we need to use them judiciously to solve our bigger problems rather than increasing the problems that we have at the hand.
If OT in the cloud wasn't a thing, then products like Nozomi Vantage and this type of distributed SaaS based OT monitoring and all these things wouldn't exist. They exist because different markets have different requirements. Again, the building technologies market in specific, they don't have the budget, they don't have the scale to run massive on-prem instances. So in cases like that, yes, they are looking at things like integration services in the cloud and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, with that, I would like to thank you again, Daniel, for putting this up. This is a very closely knit discussion. I really enjoyed it, and I think people who join online and the people who are watching it offline on YouTube, they would really enjoy this discussion. It actually gives a guidance on a focused manner to design a defensible architecture and consider that core principles with those pitfalls that we have discussed. Thank you once again, and I really look forward to the next episodes in the series. Uh, with that, I bid a very good evening to the people who are joining from the evening region. Very good rest of your day. If you are joining from the different region, see you guys in the next episode.